very warm welcome back to The Doctor Will See You Now. I say warm, given the recent temperatures that there have been in the UK. But I hope that even in this heat, you're keeping hydrated and you are finding those books that transport you to a different time, that enable you to immerse yourself in all the dark mysteries possible. And for any of those readers or listeners out there who, well, for you traveling back to a different time, if you haven't come across this book yet, oh, please, 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 I beg you to get your hands on it one way or another, because you will be transported to a very, very delicious read, albeit sometimes unpleasant in parts, but it's all part of the tale. And bringing us that tale, I do believe this is your debut novel, Bridget. Is that correct? Bridget Walsh, welcome, welcome. How are you?
I'm very good. I'm very good. Yes, very hot here as well. It was freezing in Norwich last week, so we must have gone up about 20 degrees here virtually overnight. But yes, I am a debut. So the book is The Tumbling Girl.
Look at that. Just hold it still for a minute so we get a... Oh, look at that. So that I'm struck by the green of your walls and the green of the book. There's a
there's a little bit, I'm now calling this Tumbling Girl green in the background. The cover is beautiful. Gallic, my publishers, have done a fantastic job on the cover.
They really have. I felt when the book popped through the letterbox, and I just thought, you should never judge a book by its cover, they say, but that idea of a book cover being the thing that would draw us in to find out more. And I certainly think that they did that with that image of the the acrobat, that tumbling girl on the cover as well. There's those questions: who is this? Who is she? What part does she play in the story? That backdrop of that form of entertainment back in the Victorian era, all about that. And you really do, you take the reader, well, back in time. I know we were saying before we started recording, I felt that I was sat in the room where the performers get ready. I felt like I'd been taken down some of the less salubrious back alleys and those gentlemen clubs of the time, capturing that sense on the page. Wonderful work, Bridget. I mean, before we pull the book gently, well, we're not going to pull it apart, as we've said. We're going to just probe delicately and find out more. There's no pulling apart here, just a total celebration. I'd like to ask you a few questions because it's the first time we've had a chance to chat. And I'm just intrigued to know. So you studied English Lit at the university. And so let's go back to that moment in time and ask, when you were at university, was the Victorian era your favourite era for literature, or did you have a different period that you were more engaged with?
That's a really good question. And it was, I mean, this is a long time ago now that I did my BA, but we had this option in our third year to sort of design our own syllabus a little bit more. And I kind of focused a lot more on the 19th century. I had a really great teacher at the time, and that just kind of, I just fell in love with the period. I don't know, I love those really big chunky Victorian novels where you're just totally absorbed in this world for a long period of time, and it just fascinated me. I don't really know what it was that drew me to it, but I just loved it. And I was really lucky. I had, as I say, a great teacher who was sort of saying, what do you want to read? You tell me what you want to read, and then that's what we can work on. And that was the beginning of it all, really, I think.
Yeah. Wonderful. Now, it's wrong of me to ask you, did you have a favorite text by then that you would still go to now? But I think I'm going to do it because, I mean, I know, as you say, there are so many. but let's do that awful thing. If they said you can only ever retain one novel from that period, can you think of one amongst many that you probably would choose? But is there one that you would call out?
I think I didn't, when I was an undergraduate, I wasn't a huge fan of Dickens, which is kind of ironic because I have now learned to love Dickens. But one of the Dickens novels that leapt out at me all those years ago and that I have gone back to a few times and I still love is Our Mutual Friend.
Okay.
And I love that book. I think it's kind of dark, it's absorbing, it's got literature's first stalker in it. It's got this really tortured soul. It's got a beautiful love story. I convinced a friend of mine to read it recently and she was just swept away in it. So I think, yeah, if you said to me, you can only take one Victorian novel, it would be a very tough decision, but I think it would be Our Mutual Friend.
What has struck me, thank you for sharing that. And what struck me is how we change as readers. And again, I would urge people listening, if you think historical crime fiction, not for me, well, you never know. Bridget's book might just change your mind. Yeah, that's what I would say. But thank you for sharing that with us about the choice that you would make, an extremely difficult choice. I know. You went on to teach English. And again, I'm wondering, I mean, I've got the number 23 years here. I mean, that's mammoth service. That is a life of dedication to the profession, without a doubt. And I just wondered again, were you an English lit or English language, or did you do all?
At secondary level, I did both, and then I moved into sixth form where I did a bit of English language, but my love was always English lit.
Always was lit. And and again, like the texts that you were allowed, of course, because of the syllabus, did you find students engaged with certain texts better than others?
Yeah, definitely. And the absolute winner, because I remember when I went into teaching, everyone said to me, oh, how are you going to teach Shakespeare to teenagers? The absolute winner is Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare wins hands down every time.
That is, I love that. Yeah.
Once you get young people, they have a bit of an obstacle with the language. But once you can get them past that and say, look, it's still English. It isn't a foreign language. They love it. There's Shakespeare, hands down, every time. I would just think, great, I can make this work. They're going to love it.
Yeah. And as you say, once, I think it's that thing, isn't it, that once we can get past a different way of talking about things, Shakespeare just really brings us stories that are as relevant now as they were then. That the human condition and people's hopes, dreams, fears. Those fights, and of course love. Deep seated in many of his pieces. So, Bridget, we haven't even begun talking about your work, and already I have the tingles because of what you're saying. And then you took the amazing plunge and went and got yourself a PhD. Yeah. I mean, humongous congratulations, because it's the kind of path I always think that it is not for the faint-hearted, and it has so many challenges, and to have completed that so successfully, brilliant. But you went back to examine Victorian domestic murder. Yeah. What a glorious focus for a piece of for a project of that size. I presume there was much to look at, because this was looking at fact rather than fiction.
Both.
Yeah.
And I kind of, I decided if I was good, I'd already got a master's in Victorian studies, and I thought that was going to be the end of it, and I would then go back to real life. But I thought, if I'm going to do a PhD, it's got to be something I'm really interested in, that I'm really excited about. And I just thought, okay, let's look at this. And initially it was a much broader scope, and I realized fairly early on I had to narrow it down a bit. But yeah, I looked at murders in novels and plays, and then I also looked at actual cases that are the kind of the most notorious cases of the 19th century, and kind of looked at how the representation of the murderer in the novels and on the stage, how far that tallied with what we were getting in the press. It was just a joy from start to finish. And I know not everyone can say that about their PhD.
This is true. This is true.
But I just loved it. The only thing I didn't love was the Viva, which I've never been so scared in my whole life. But the rest of it was great.
Yeah. Again, to be able to, to have dedicated that time to something, and I wonder again, coming back to, the book under discussion, The Tumbling Girl, I think the way with which you write the detail there, bears testament to the amount of work that you did for your PhD. It comes out there really, really, without it being, for anybody who would find something like that a dry academic study, it's not. The way you write is so vibrant, but it oozes, vital detail. Yeah,
that is so nice for you to say that. And it's interesting because I did the PhD and I realized quite early on I didn't want to become a university academic. I was still teaching a bit all the way through it, and I thought, no, I want to go back to teaching in schools and colleges. And when the PhD was over, I kind of thought that was great, and I'll never talk about that again, or I'll probably never use it again. And now I'm talking about it and using it all the time. And it's such a joy to be able to bring that kind of academic study to fiction. I mean, you have to leave 99% of the research off the page because you would just bore people rigid otherwise. But just to be able to spend my days researching strange little quirks of Victorian life and then putting them in this fictional world it's a dream. It's an absolute dream.
Yeah. Oh, The Tumbling Girl. It's a thrill to know it's the first in a series. I love that, because very often authors provide us with some beautiful text, and then we find out, oh, it's a standalone, and it's like, oh, okay, it's fine, but it's a series. And as we said, the novel and subsequent ones set in the 1870s. And what struck me is the fact that from the perspective from which it's written, or one of the key perspectives, that idea of a working class heroine. I really appreciated that. And those insights around class and privilege as well, that of course that brings in, because we'll find out that she ends up working with somebody else who is from a different part of society, and all that does. We've mentioned, of course, that published by Gallic, a publisher that was new to me, and again, so I'm really grateful for the chance to see what they're doing. Again, those other publishers that are out there and that are working alongside fabulous authors to create the texts that they bring us, so that's great. And I did read that number 2, if I'm right, it's called The Innocents.
It is.
Yeah, and it'll be out March next year, so not too long to wait. But let us then get in between the pages, as it were, and let's start some gentle. What is it, Bridget, about the Victorians? It's a bit like of all the time periods in all the world. You've spoken about your love of the literature of that period, but what other aspects of this time in British society, draws you and fascinates you?
I think it's the fact that I think a lot of people have a conception of what the Victorians were. I think they're much closer to us than we realise. I think they had a lot of the same concerns. They were very worried about, the speed of life changing, new technologies and the impact that was going to have on day-to-day life. There was, I'm so glad you mentioned about Minnie, the heroine, being working class, because that was really important to me. I wanted to put a working class woman absolutely in the center of the story, but not have her class be an obstacle. I wanted her
Yes.
to have agency and to move with confidence through that world. But it was also a time when how people were seeing women was changing. We had kind of the early movements towards female suffrage. There was a lot going on, I think, that mirrors our time, but in a way that I think, for me, it's that slight distance. We talked before you started recording about things that offer an element of escapism. And, you know, I find the world at the moment quite a tricky place to deal with everything that's going on. And to me, it's a great escape to go into this world I've created and hopefully touch on issues that are still really pertinent to us today, but that we can explore kind of, I suppose, through a slightly different lens.
Yeah, yeah. I wondered as well, just to carry on with the sense of, we talked about your research before, but if we can talk about your research for the book, and I know there may be some overlap between study and this, but when you were preparing The Tumbling Girl, was there anything that maybe you hadn't come across before in previous research that you felt, I just have to, you know, Minnie's story, everything that she and the people around her go through, I have to find a way to incorporate this into the narrative?
Yeah, I mean, weirdly enough, I had, for the PhD, I'd written a fair bit about Victorian theatre, which again was a very kind of class-based thing. I won't go into the whole background of it all, but it was a way for working class dissent, I suppose. What I didn't know much about was music hall. So that obviously was a great avenue that opened up for me, because the novel is set in a somewhat down at heel music hall called the Variety Palace. And there were lots of bits along the way. And I think, you know, I was, weirdly enough, earlier on, I was just listening, because Jasmine Blackborough, who does a brilliant job of reading it on Audible, I was just listening to the bit where I talk about there being a boxing scene, and I know nothing about boxing, nothing at all. But it's that thing where you think, okay, I can't just say Albert's watching a fight, you know, and then have nothing. So and I love that element of it. I love that there's always little things. I think, oh, I need to find out about that. Or I need to go and I need a fancy house. So I need to kind of find a fancy house in London I can go and have a look at and get the visuals in my head. So there are lots of little bits along the way, I think, and I love that. I don't see that as a distraction from the work at all. I think it's one of my favorite things, really.
I totally agree with you from the point of view of the reader as well. Not a distraction in the slightest, just adds such beautiful color around it. So the Variety Palace and this music hall, before I ask you about it specifically, in general, at the time, were they places, because you mentioned about, you know, like working class subversion, but were they places where there was like an overlap between classes? I mean, did people from the upper class, you know, deign to, you know, to enter those murky waters, you know, because of what it might hold, the temptations, the possibilities?
Yeah, definitely. I think you had a very broad audience there, and you had some people from the upper classes who would, I suppose, you know, they might be going to see, you know, maybe to see if life offered some more excitement than they could get in their day-to-day existence. But it was, you know, it was quite, and the great thing about it as well was it was a great space for it's not a word that the Victorians, I think, would have used, but for diversity. I think one of the things that attracted me was that it's a world that's much more accepting of difference. It was a world where women could achieve a degree of financial independence, which might not be so easy elsewhere, particularly working class women. But it was a world where you could, you know, difference was more acceptable and less commented on, which I think it always has been. I think the theatre and the arts, you know, they embrace that diversity.
Yeah.
And that's why I think I wanted to set it there. Plus the fun of being able to bring in new characters, you know, and the slight chaos that reigns at the Variety Palace. And yet somehow it keeps going. So.
It resonated a lot with myself and life of chaos reigning, but carrying on. Anyway, you know, you mentioned that diversity and the fact, you know, people's performances, you know, being able to perform the other gender or another gender, being able to be different, and it be celebrated or at least appreciated as performance. And maybe it's that sense of within the confines of that space, you know, whilst it's a very fixed space, is it that it's this liminal space, so things can occur because they're not spilling out into, you know, decent society.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I think that as a writer, that offers endless potential, I think. But it is a way of engaging with those issues about you know, otherness or diversity or whatever term you want to use for it. And saying, look, you know, this isn't completely new. This isn't a 21st century invention, you know.
Yes. Yeah.
And I touch on it more as well in The Innocents. So Bernard Reynolds, he's quite a minor character in The Tumbling Girl. He's a kind of ex-Shakespearean actor, but he comes to the fore a bit more in The Innocents. And it's just, you've got to be careful with it though, because of course there was a lot of prejudice. You know, there was you know, towards women, towards people of different sexualities, towards, you know, different races and colors. So and what you don't want to do is write something that's just full of, you know, venom from other characters. So it's kind of giving the palaces a place where those things can be accepted more, and other opinions can kind of ping into that space. But then you've got Minnie, who's just, you know, Minnie accepts people largely as they are, apart from Toffs. She's got a bit of an issue about Toffs.
Yeah, that's, I suppose it's what we would call her unconscious bias these days.
Yeah,
but,
indeed.
Yeah. But yeah, justified, I would say. But anyway, I got one last question on the Variety Palace. You mentioned, you know, like if you needed a certain kind of property, you would go look for one. Is the Variety Palace based on anywhere specifically, or have you used a nice blending of different places, or is this purely a construction of your own imaginings?
I was really lucky that early on I got to go to Hoxton Hall. So I think there's only two Victorian musicals that are still functioning as entertainment venues in London. And one of them is Hoxton Hall. And I got shown around the whole of it, backstage, everywhere. And that is the place in my head when I think about the palace. And prior to that, it was kind of this slightly nebulous idea about it's a bit like a theatre. But now I think about Hoxton Hall.
Great. So we should come to the main character and her sidekick, so Minnie Ward. She's billed as theatre performer turned scriptwriter. Tell us about you and Minnie. How long was Minnie with you before she appeared on the page? As Minnie's developed, are you as fond of her as you were when you started with her, or are you fonder now as you've got to know her better? So author and main character, talk to us about that relationship.
I have to confess, I love her. I feel like, I mean, this sounds a bit fanciful, but I I don't feel like I create her. I feel like she's just kind of waiting. And then when I get to the computer, she's like, right, okay, come on, let's go. She initially, because I did a master's at UEA in creative writing, and the very first piece I wrote, she was married to Albert, and she barely said a word for the whole chapter. And I remember having a workshop, and Bill Ryan, who was my tutor, said, whose story is this? And I said, he said, because I think this is Albert's story. I went, it's not Albert's story. I said, this is Minnie's story. And he said, well, then we need to see her. And so then I thought, actually, if I take them back to when they first meet, it's a great potential for some conflict, and for misunderstanding, you know, on both parts. I think they don't really know who the other person is to start off with. But I love her. I think she's kind of this idealized version of what I wish I could have been at her age. I think as you get older, you care less about what other people think. But, you know, when I was in my 20s, I was very anxious about those kind of things. And I just love that I love her outspokenness. I love her heart and how much time she's got for people, and how hard she's fought to get to where she is. I think she's had a tough start in life, as a lot of women did at that time and still do. And she's battled to get where she is, and she doesn't want to give 1 inch of that away. And that's kind of why she's she's very resistant to the idea of any kind of romantic entanglement, because she just worries she's going to lose everything she's fought for, really.
Yeah, I like her resistance, because Albert, bless him, and the feelings that he harbours. Albert then. So private detective, Albert Easterbrook, and there's a line in the book that talks of him as champion of the labouring classes. It's how he advertised himself. A gentleman detective whose mission was to help those who cannot help themselves. So Albert's background, until we're able to get to know him in the book, talk to us a little bit about Albert and why you chose to create him in that vein.
I think I kind of realised early on I wanted to write a series, and I thought, if I'm going to write a series, I need my focus to be on my detective or detectives rather than my villains. I'm naturally very drawn to the villains. I like writing evil.
Bridget, what does that say about you?
I know. Well, yes, it says something but I do like writing bad characters, but I thought, if I'm going to have a working class woman, I thought, with the best will in the world, there are places she's not going to be able to go. And there will be limits on what she can do. And Minnie doesn't think there are any limits on what she can do, but the world says otherwise. So I thought she kind of needs somebody to work alongside who can access those more elite areas of society. And Albert has got a cut glass accent. He comes across as very posh, but he's I talked earlier about Minnie having agency and kind of owning her world. Albert doesn't feel he belongs anywhere in the world until he meets Minnie. And then that's the surprise, that somehow this chaotic world of the palace, and Minnie in particular, he suddenly thinks, maybe this is where I belong. So I like the idea of taking a man who seemingly has all the advantages in life. He's from a wealthy, privileged background. He's had a very advantaged education. He's turned his back on all that to really in response to something that happens to him as a child, which comes out later in the novel. And he becomes a police officer, which is seen as a terrible, terrible disgrace by his parents. And then eventually he moves into becoming a private detective. So I like the idea of taking somebody who seemingly has all the advantages and pitting him against somebody who seemingly doesn't have many, but she's the one who who's much more in control, I think, and he's a bit adrift at times.
Yeah.
Doesn't quite know what to make of it all.
Yeah, I really appreciated the difference. We talk about difference, and and together they are other as well. What they form. I think that is so strong. When you were looking at private investigators of the time, what was happening at that time, and does Albert reflect very much the kind of characters who in real life were doing that kind of work?
He doesn't really. I mean, believe it or not, they were actually female private detectives at the time.
Wow. Okay.
They didn't. They were quite limited in what they did, and they did exist. There weren't many of them, but the whole area, I think, of private detective. I think Albert draws probably a bit more on the fictional idea of a private detective. There was still a bit of a stigma. I think the police was seen as, very much open to bribes, as were private detectives. There was this, I'm not saying that might not still happen occasionally, but so he's kind of, I suppose he is more from a fictional world of a private detective, in that he is, he's a gentleman, he is a toff, as Minnie describes him. Which I think would have been less likely at the time. They tended to be people who kind of often had connections with an underworld and were kind of straddling a bit that gap between, being a criminal themselves and then actually helping to catch the criminals. So he is slightly idealized, I think.
Isn't that like in France, in real life at the time, that Vidocq, I think it's Vidocq, the first sort of like commissioner himself, previously had a life of crime, and so that sense of understanding the
and I think there was suspicion, I think, on the part of because I mean, the police at one point were referred to as thief takers, and because there was so that you could in the early days of the police force, they were sort of paid for getting information together, and it was this whole suspicion about, well, how are you getting that information? Do you have a foot in that camp already? So yes, Albert is I would say he's quite honorable. He doesn't want to do anything too underhand.
Yeah, I would agree. A good chap, definitely. Another of the characters who I found intriguing was Mr. Edward Tansford, known as Tansy. Yeah, I can see he's an important character to you. So he's the owner of the Variety Palace. But share with us, Edward Tansy for you, Bridget. Where does he sit in your world that you've created?
I'm so glad you've mentioned him, because I really love Tansy. I'm incredibly fond of him. And I remember when I was writing the book and was sharing it with people, and some of my female friends were going, I don't get this thing why, he seems to have a lot of success with women, and I don't get it. And I was saying, I love him. But he bears no physical resemblance, but he does bear some resemblances to my husband. So Tansy is short, my husband is tall, but my husband, Mickey and I both grew up in London, and my husband still retains very much his London accent. He still uses a lot of slang phrases. There's lots of bits in the book that are just things that he says, and I quickly jot it down. And so I love Tansy because he's very much, he's fallen into a slightly grey area. He does things that are possibly illegal, but if not illegal, they are morally dubious on occasion. But he's making his way in the world. He's living in this, world of entertainment. He's got to get bums on seats. And he's a good man. And I think one of the real defining things for me early on when thinking about him as a character was Minnie is young, and her mother has died. This is her backstory, and she ends up at the Variety Palace. She's trying to find work or go somewhere. And he never, ever lays a finger on her or takes advantage of her, or, you know, he brings her into that world. She's got to earn her keep there. She's, you know, she ends up being a performer. But he never exploits his position. And I think that's a really important thing about him. He's, you know, he's loud and occasionally very tactless, and sometimes says very politically incorrect things. But his heart is in a good place, and he is attractive to women, but he never, you know, he could so easily use his position to say, okay, you know, you want a slot further on up the billing, you're going to have to do something to get that. And he never does. And I think that kind of defines him in my mind, really.
And I love the way that you've done that, in the sense of, you couldn't, and I think it's one of the hard things writing historically, because you can't change how people behaved. You know, again, you know, I know there's a lot of debate going on what we can and can't do with text, because of the times we're in and the way, you know, things are being thought about. So yes, there are certain things he says that you just go, oh, really? But he would, because it's then. But you ensured that he didn't indulge in practices that, of course, probably hundreds of men in his position would have done quite happily. Probably, you know, it was the expected thing. So, you know, not making it right at all. So I thought that was a clever way to avoid certain things, you know, that readers today would think, oh, I can't go there.
And although he does say some dubious things, often Minnie is there to pick him up on it and remind him that that really isn't okay. But yeah, you know, that's the thing. You know, going back to what I was saying earlier, I'm writing about a period where, you know, people said terrible things, you know, things that would just be completely unacceptable now, but they were said and they were thought. And I don't think you can create you can't create too sanitized a world, because then it doesn't feel real. Yeah,
definitely. Now, speaking of feeling real, there was a line that I read, and it says, and it's about the theatre becoming ready. It says, the lamplighters were at work. Hundreds of gas burners around the auditorium were being coaxed into life. Yeah, and it's easy to forget. Again, surroundings, what were they like? And I was just thinking again, from the research that you've done, was this not dangerous?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. Yes, it definitely was.
You know, who got to sit under the gas burner, and were you constantly like watching in case, you know, anything, you know?
Yeah, and the amount of naked flames there were everywhere.
Yeah.
But that thing about that's, I remember we had a masterclass from Erin Kelly, and she said one of the things to think about is, where does the light come in? You know, where, how if you're creating a setting, how does the light come in? And the number of I think I created a completely fictitious form of lighting at one point, and my husband read it and he went, no, that doesn't. And I was saying, but I kind of need it to exist. But yeah, it is that thing. Oh God, yeah. I mean, health and safety it didn't exist.
No.
You know, you took your chances, and you know, if you got through the day and you were still alive at the end, you'd done pretty well, I think.
Yeah. To take a bit of a more serious, shall we say, note than what we've been talking about. So the idea that for you there are issues that are dealt with in the novel. We've mentioned class and gender and social mobility and things like that. To what extent, for you as the author, are you keen to address those issues rather than tell, you know, the mysteries, the crimes? I suppose it's like, is it more your social conscience that comes out as an author, or the telling of the story? Where is the balance for you?
I think addressing the issues, you know, that's such an interesting question, because those things just came out and I didn't even think about it. And the more I write this series, the more I realize that that is, it's just, you know, it runs through me like a stick of rock, you know. It's just, I had another interview a while ago, and they said, you know, you talk about injustice, and why do you talk about that? And I thought, well, because things aren't fair, and the world still isn't fair.
Oh yeah.
And people are still disadvantaged in all sorts of ways, and other people have extreme privilege just by an accident of birth. And I think the older I get, the stronger I feel about that. But then equally, you don't want to be lecturing your audience. You know, I think anybody who reads the book would get it to the end of it and kind of think, yeah, I probably guess where Bridget's political leanings lie. But then you've got to write a good story. You know,
Yes,
your
yeah.
reader has got to want to turn the page, and that is weirdly enough, given that I write crime fiction, that is the bit I find the hardest, is, you know, keeping it going and thinking, okay, how are we going to keep this, you know, the detective side of it going, and keep the reader's interest and make it credible, because that's another thing. I don't want people to feel, well, that's just a ridiculous leap of luck or logic that they've come to that conclusion. But I think the kind of that idea about injustice, about just about fairness. You know, I grew up, my parents were Irish. They came to this country because they had to. There was no work in Ireland. And, you know, when I grew up, I read voraciously, but there weren't people like me in those books. They were, you know, if they were working class, they were servants often. And I think it still really matters. I'd love to say it doesn't matter anymore, and that we've reached this wonderful, fair, classless society. We so
if only. And I think for me, it's that sense of, you know, the kind of, you know, the approach that you have to your work, like so many authors. It's that idea for me of, you know, this process has begun, and now if we can open the doors or bring voices to as many people as possible, you know, so that everybody at some point can say, God, I recognized myself on the page.
Yeah, I think that's it. And I think, you know, you hear a lot of you know, there's been a lot of debate about it, you know, with writers of color saying, you know, there was nobody like me in the pages of books, and how important that is. And it extends to everything, I think. And like I said before, to have a working class girl who is, you know, she's brave and fearless, and she's independent, and she's making her way in the world, and she's not going to compromise for people. And I think it's really important to see that. And it may be in a slightly idealized fictional world, but it's still saying, you know, you can be this person. You can, you know, sometimes I kind of think, well, what would Minnie do? You know?
Yes. Yeah.
And she, you know, she's kind of she's what I want, you know, all women to be, and all working class women to be, and to just feel that they own their world, and they've, you know, they can do what they wish in it.
Yeah. A big amen to that. Now, crimes and misdemeanors that we find within the pages, because we want people to find out about them, so we don't want to give too much away. But if you could give us a sense of what evil lies between the pages.
So, well, I suppose I don't want to give too much away. I suppose the book takes the reader from scenes of great privilege, where things are not what they might appear on the surface, to you know, the phrase has been used about the seedy underbelly of the city, but it's there. And some kind of, I mean, very early in the book, I take the reader to the Adelphi Arches, which was this absolutely appalling part of London, right near between the Strand and the Thames. And so yeah, there's quite a lot of murders. My tutor said to me at one point, if in doubt, kill somebody. So occasionally I've done that. But yeah, I think it's about the kind of the darkness in the world. And I think Minnie is trying to, I think that's why the Variety Palace in a way is often quite light, and there's quite a lot of comedy in it to counterbalance against the darkness. There are some pretty unpleasant things that happen in the book. And I like the fact that I can use Minnie as a way of exploring what is the impact of that. So very early on in the book, this isn't giving anything away, Minnie's best friend is found hanging under the Adelphi Arches, and the police just think it's suicide. And Minnie and her friend's mother, Ida, think that no way
She
would she
wouldn't,
have done that, which is how they end up hiring Albert to investigate. And then Minnie insinuates herself into the investigation. But the idea about the impact on those who are left behind as well, you know, that so there is violence in the novel, and there is, you know, some things are very dark, but it's about what does that do to those who witness it as well.
Yeah.
I hope none of it's gratuitous. I would hate to think it is, because I think it is, you know, Minnie changes, and she changes in the next book as well because of what she is exposed to. And I think that's the thing, is that we, you know, it's and increasingly I think we're seeing that in true crime coverage on TV and in books, that they are now starting to say, well, let's talk about the impact on the families and the friends, rather than talking about the killer, who's often the least interesting. I know I said I like writing villains, but you know, in real life, it's about the victims and those who love them.
Yeah. As opposed to, lifting up the person who's committed the crime. I'm going to steer us away, you know, as we come towards the close of our consultation. I'm going to steer us away from the murkiness and the unpleasantness, because I think it was last week I saw a wonderful picture of you. I think it was on Twitter or Instagram. And there you were in the chocolate library. So, you know, it was, you know, I was doing a little bit of research around you. So it was lovely to find you, but it was even better to find you in the chocolate library. It seemed to combine two of life's best things, chocolate and books, in a way. But tell us about that space, and how did you find yourself there in amongst the chocolate?
So the chocolate library, so I live in Norwich, and the kind of local department store in Norwich is called Gerald's. It's a lovely shop, and down in the basement they've got a kind of a foodie section, and they've got places where you can, you know, have bits and pieces to eat and everything, and they have a chocolate library. And I thought that, as you've rightly said, I thought that's combining two of my favorite words. And I just thought, what a great place, you know, and what a great concept, rather than just saying here's some chocolate, to refer to it as a chocolate library. And Gerald's themselves retweeted me afterwards and were saying, you know, so glad you liked it. And but yeah, I thought it was a great idea.
Yeah, I have to say it was wonderful. And I think, you know, again, that sense of authors and local businesses, you know, the connections, you know, to champion each other. I think it's really, really important. And the notion then of that championing people. At the back of the book, anybody who's watched or listened to the show previously knows that I am a massive fan of acknowledgements, because I think it helps us as readers, you know, see underneath the layers and understand a little bit of, you know, the work that's gone into putting a book together, that the author's support network that's there, key people that have been involved in enabling that production. And you start off by saying how much acknowledgements you enjoy, so I thought this was lovely to pass this on. I'm going to give you one of those difficult things again, you know, because you mentioned a number of people, but the fact that we can now hold or listen to and to enjoy The Tumbling Girl. Is there anybody you'd like to give a particular shout out for from amongst those acknowledgements?
Oh, that is a hard question.
It is,
can I
isn't
make
it?
it two people?
Of course you can. Yeah, come on. Why not? Yeah.
So one person would be my agent, because this book took a long time to sell. It went out on submission the first time not long before we went into lockdown. And she never lost faith. And she kept saying to me, it's going to sell, it's going to sell. And I kept thinking, it isn't going to sell. And I tried to write other things, and I just kept wanting to go back to these characters. And she remained, she just remained true to the whole thing. And she said, no, it will work. It might take longer than we thought, but it will work. So Isabel Dixon at Blake Friedman, who's my agent, was amazing. And then I suppose the other person is my husband, because he reads my work. I know this, lots of people think this is a horrific concept, and I've been told, God, no, never let your loved ones read it. But he not only reads it and gives really useful feedback. When we walk our dogs in the morning, that's when we talk about plot, and I'll go, I'm kind of, I think I want to do this. And he's really good at kind of the credibility thing. He has this face that he pulls, which I really hate, but is really useful, where I'm trying to shoehorn in something that is not shoehornable. And I'm going, but I really want to write that scene. It'd be a really good scene. He'll go, yeah, but that wouldn't happen. So he's just great, and he supports me completely, and he's put up with this kind of crazy journey that I've been on. He's immensely proud of me, which is wonderful. So if I have to pick two people, it's those two.
I'm sorry to make you choose, because I know there are other people there. And again, readers, listeners, get yourself to the back of the book and you will see. But I'm grateful, Bridget, for you sharing with us, just two of those people and how they've helped you. Will the book sell? Well, yes, of course it will. Of course it will. I wish you all the very best, not just with The Tumbling Girl, but with the series, because I think Minnie and Albert, and that cast of people around them, is, as I said at the beginning, what a world you have given us. That whilst there may be a lot that reflects our concerns of now, at least we can forget those that are present and engage with those from the past, which is, it's lovely to be able to do that. It has been a joy to spend time with you. I really, really hope that this will not be the only time you and I get to talk. And if ever there were a possibility, I know Norwich is a bit of a way away from Newcastle, but if there was ever a chance that you could make it up for Newcastle Noir, I would love that. So let's talk, and with your publishers, and let's see if we could make that happen.
We might be able to talk about that once we've stopped recording, if possible.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, we can indeed. But for now, viewers, listeners, thank you for joining us here for The Doctor Will See You Now with Bridget Walsh discussing The Tumbling Girl. Please get yourself out there and get a copy one way or another. Goodbye for now, Bridget. Thank you.
And thank you, Jackie. It's been great.
Bye.